It was just another quiet afternoon in the small town of Crestwood, where the streets were usually calm, and the biggest drama was the occasional argument over parking spots at the local grocery store. But on this particular day, something happened that would shake the town to its core. A story that would spread like wildfire, leaving everyone questioning what they thought they knew about justice, power, and the thin line between right and wrong. It all started with a routine traffic stop. A black SUV was cruising down Maple Avenue, its windows tinted, its license plate slightly obscured by mud. Two police officers, Officers Daniels and Harris, were on patrol when they noticed the vehicle. To them, it looked suspicious, just enough to warrant a closer look. Little did they know, this stop would unravel a chain of events that would leave them, and the entire town, reeling. The driver, a poised and confident black woman in her early 40s, stepped out of the car when asked. She was dressed sharply in a tailored blazer and slacks, her demeanor calm but firm. The officers, perhaps influenced by their own biases, immediately assumed she was being uncooperative. They didn't ask her name. They didn't ask why she was in the area. Instead, they began questioning her aggressively, their tone dripping with suspicion. "Ma'am, do you know why we pulled you over?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice tight. She responded calmly, "No, officer, I don't. But I'd appreciate it if you could explain." Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a quiet authority that seemed to unsettle the officers. They exchanged a glance, their unease growing. Something about her didn't fit the narrative they'd already constructed in their minds. As the interaction escalated, the woman remained composed, refusing to be intimidated. She asked if she was being detained and requested to speak with a supervisor. But instead of de-escalating the situation, the officers doubled down. They handcuffed her, claiming she was resisting arrest, a claim that would later be disputed by eyewitnesses who saw the entire encounter unfold. The woman didn't struggle. She didn't raise her voice. But as she was led to the patrol car, she locked eyes with Officer Daniels and said something that sent a chill down his spine. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but the officers brushed them off, convinced they were just empty threats. They had no way of knowing the truth, that the woman they were arresting was none other than Evelyn Carter, the state's chief prosecutor, a woman known for her unwavering commitment to justice and her relentless pursuit of corruption. By the time they reached the station, the atmosphere was tense. Evelyn was processed like any other suspect, her requests for a phone call ignored. But as the hours passed, whispers began to spread through the precinct. Someone had recognized her. Someone had put the pieces together. And when the realization finally hit, it hit hard. The officers who had arrested her were called into the chief's office, their faces pale, their hands trembling. The chief didn't yell. He didn't need to. His silence was enough to convey the gravity of the situation. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their confidence crumbling. They had messed up, big time. But it wasn't just about the arrest. It was about what came next. Because Evelyn Carter wasn't just any prosecutor. She was the kind of woman who didn't let things slide, and she had every intention of holding them accountable. As the news of the arrest began to leak, the town of Crestwood found itself at the center of a media storm. People were outraged, demanding answers. How could something like this happen? How could two officers mistake the state's chief prosecutor for a criminal? And more importantly, what did this say about the systemic issues plaguing their community? Evelyn, now free, stood at the heart of it all, her presence commanding attention. She had a choice to make, one that would define not just her career, but the future of justice in Crestwood. Would she use her power to seek retribution, or would she take a different path, one that could lead to real, lasting change? The town held its breath, waiting to see what she would do. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the sun set over Crestwood, casting long shadows over the quiet streets, the tension in the air was palpable. Something big was coming, something that would change everything. And it all started with a traffic stop that went horribly wrong. The story of Evelyn Carter didn't begin in the back of a patrol car on a quiet afternoon in Crestwood. It began years earlier, in a small, struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where she grew up watching her parents fight for every opportunity they could get. Her father, a factory worker, and her mother, a school teacher, had instilled in her a deep sense of justice and the belief that no one should be treated unfairly because of who they were or where they came from. Evelyn had carried that belief with her through law school, through her early days as a public defender, and all the way to her current role as the state's chief prosecutor. She had built her career on holding people accountable, especially those in power who thought they were untouchable. And now, ironically, she found herself on the other side of the system she had dedicated her life to reforming. As the hours ticked by in the precinct, Evelyn sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room, her hands still cuffed, her mind racing. She knew the officers had no idea who she was, at least not yet. But she also knew that when they found out, the fallout would be massive. She thought about her team at the prosecutor's office, about the cases she was working on, about the reforms she had been pushing for. This incident, as shocking as it was, could be a turning point. It could expose the deep-seated biases that still existed within the system, even in a town as seemingly peaceful as Crestwood, but it could also backfire, turning her into a symbol of division rather than change. She had to tread carefully. Every move she made from this point forward would be scrutinized. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, the town was already buzzing with rumors. Word had spread quickly, thanks to a few bystanders who had filmed parts of the arrest on their phones. The videos were grainy and shaky, but they were enough to spark outrage. People were sharing them online, along with hashtags like Justice for Evelyn and Just Crestwood Accountability. Some were calling for the officers to be fired immediately. Others were defending them, arguing that they were just doing their jobs. The divide was clear, and it was growing wider by the minute. Crestwood, a town that had always prided itself on its sense of community, was suddenly on the brink of a full-blown crisis. Back at the station, Officer Daniels was pacing nervously in the break room. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. He had been a cop for over a decade, and he had always believed he was one of the good guys. But now, as he replayed the events of the afternoon in his mind, he wasn't so sure. He thought about the way he had spoken to Evelyn, the assumptions he had made, the way he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. He had always told himself that he treated everyone the same, but deep down he knew that wasn't entirely true. And now, those biases had landed him in a situation he didn't know how to get out of. His partner, Officer Harris, was sitting at the table, staring at his phone. The videos of the arrest were everywhere, and the comments were brutal. "Racist cops strike again," one person had written. "This is why people don't trust the police," another had said. Harris felt a knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. He had joined the force to make a difference, to protect people, but now he was being painted as the villain, and he wasn't sure he could argue otherwise. He looked up at Daniels, who was still pacing, and said, "What are we gonna do, man? This is bad, really bad." Daniels didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. As the tension inside the precinct continued to build, Evelyn was finally allowed to make her phone call. She dialed the number of her deputy, Marcus Green, a sharp and loyal attorney who had been with her since her early days as a prosecutor. When he answered, his voice was calm but concerned. "Evelyn, where are you? We've been trying to reach you for hours." She took a deep breath and said, "I'm at the Crestwood precinct. I've been arrested." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Marcus said, "I'm on my way. Don't say another word until I get there." Evelyn hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. Marcus would know what to do, he always did. But even as she waited for him to arrive, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just her. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. It was about a system that had failed too many people for too long. She thought about the cases she had worked on over the years, cases where people of color had been unfairly targeted, where justice had been denied because of prejudice or incompetence. She had always fought for them. But now, she was living it. And she knew that if she didn't handle this carefully, it could set back everything she had worked for. When Marcus finally arrived, he was accompanied by a small team of lawyers and a handful of reporters who had caught wind of the story. The precinct was in chaos, with officers scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation. The chief of police, a grizzled veteran named Tom Reynolds, was trying to maintain order, but it was clear that he was out of his depth. He had never dealt with anything like this before. When Marcus demanded to see Evelyn, Reynolds reluctantly agreed, knowing that he had no other choice. The moment Evelyn walked out of the interrogation room, the cameras started flashing. She held her head high, her expression calm but determined. She didn't say a word as Marcus led her out of the precinct, but her silence spoke volumes. The reporters shouted questions, but she ignored them, focusing instead on the crowd that had gathered outside. There were people holding signs, chanting her name, demanding justice. She felt a surge of emotion, but she didn't let it show. She knew this was just the beginning. As she got into the car with Marcus, he turned to her and said, "We need to talk about what happens next. This is going to blow up, Evelyn. We need to be ready." She nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. She knew that the next few days would be critical. She would have to make decisions that could change the course of her career and the lives of everyone involved. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She would need the support of her team, her community, and the people who believed in her. Back at the precinct, Officers Daniels and Harris were left to face the consequences of their actions. The chief had suspended them both pending an investigation, but they both knew that was just the start. Their careers, their reputations, their lives, everything was on the line. And as they sat in the empty break room, the weight of what they had done settled over them like a dark cloud. They had thought they were upholding the law, but now they were the ones who would have to answer for their mistakes. The town of Crestwood, meanwhile, was bracing for what was to come. The arrest of Evelyn Carter had opened old wounds and exposed deep divisions. People were angry, scared, and uncertain about what the future held. But amidst the chaos, there was also a glimmer of hope. Evelyn's story had sparked a conversation, one that had been a long time coming. And as the sun set over Crestwood, casting long shadows over the quiet streets, one thing was clear. This was far from over. The real story was just beginning. The next morning, Crestwood woke up to a town divided. The arrest of Evelyn Carter was no longer just a local story. It had gone viral. News outlets from across the state and even a few national ones had picked it up. The videos of the arrest were being played on repeat, dissected frame by frame, with commentators debating every detail. Some called it a clear case of racial profiling, while others argued that the officers had simply been doing their jobs. But no matter where people stood, one thing was undeniable. This was a moment that would define Crestwood for years to come. Evelyn, meanwhile, was back at her office, surrounded by her team. They had spent the night strategizing, trying to figure out the best way to handle the fallout. Marcus had suggested holding a press conference, but Evelyn wasn't sure. She knew that every word she said would be scrutinized, every gesture analyzed. She couldn't afford to make a misstep. "We need to be careful," she told her team. "This isn't just about me, it's about the system. It's about accountability. If we're going to make a statement, it has to be the right one." As the team debated their next move, Officer Daniels was sitting in his living room staring at the TV. The news was on, and his face was everywhere. He had turned off his phone hours ago, unable to handle the barrage of calls and messages. Some were from fellow officers offering support, but most were from strangers. Angry, hateful strangers who wanted him to know exactly what they thought of him. He felt like he was drowning, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had always believed he was a good cop, but now he wasn't so sure. He thought about Evelyn, about the way she had looked at him when she said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." He hadn't understood it at the time, but now, those words haunted him. Officer Harris, on the other hand, was trying to stay busy. He had spent the morning cleaning his house, scrubbing floors and dusting shelves, anything to keep his mind off what was happening. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He had always believed in the system, in the idea that if you followed the rules, you would be protected. But now, the system he had trusted was turning against him. He thought about quitting, about walking away from the force altogether. But he knew it wouldn't solve anything. He had to face this, no matter how hard it was. Back at the precinct, Chief Reynolds was dealing with his own set of problems. The Cheshire phone hadn't stopped ringing since the news broke, and he was fielding calls from everyone. City officials, community leaders, even the governor's office. Everyone wanted answers, but Reynolds didn't have any. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, but now, his department was under a microscope and he wasn't sure how to handle it. He knew he had to do something, but every option seemed fraught with risk. If he defended his officers, he would be accused of protecting bad cops. If he condemned them, he would lose the trust of his force. It was a no-win situation, and he was stuck in the middle. Meanwhile, the town of Crestwood was simmering with tension. Protests had sprung up overnight, with people gathering outside the precinct demanding justice for Evelyn. But there were counter-protests too, with people defending the officers and accusing Evelyn of playing the race card. The divide was stark, and it was growing wider by the hour. Local businesses were boarding up their windows, afraid of what might happen if things escalated. The mayor had called for calm, but her words did little to ease the growing unrest. Amidst the chaos, Evelyn's team was working tirelessly behind the scenes. They had reached out to community leaders trying to build a coalition of support. They were also gathering evidence, preparing for the possibility of a lawsuit. But Evelyn knew that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a moral one. She had to find a way to turn this moment into something meaningful, something that could lead to real change. She thought about the reforms she had been pushing for: better training for officers, more accountability, a focus on community policing. This could be the moment to make those reforms a reality, but it could also backfire, turning her into a polarizing figure rather than a unifying one. As the day wore on, the pressure continued to build. Evelyn's team finally convinced her to hold a press conference, but she insisted on doing it on her own terms. She didn't want to be rushed or cornered. She wanted to speak from the heart to make sure her message was clear. But as she stood in front of the cameras, surrounded by reporters and flashing lights, she felt a wave of doubt. What if she said the wrong thing? What if she made things worse? She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and began to speak. "What happened to me yesterday was wrong," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But it's not just about me. It's about a system that has failed too many people for too long. It's about accountability, about making sure that no one is above the law, not even those who are supposed to enforce it. This is a moment for us to come together, to have the hard conversations, to make the changes that are long overdue. But it's also a moment for us to remember that we're all human. We all make mistakes. The question is, what do we do next?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd was silent, waiting to see what she would say next. But Evelyn didn't continue. She had said what she needed to say. Now it was up to the town and the world to decide what happened next. As she walked away from the podium, the questions started flying. Will you be pressing charges? What reforms are you calling for? Do you think the officers should be fired? Evelyn didn't answer. She knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was still ahead. And as she got into the car with Marcus, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, determination, and a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. And she was ready to fight for it. Back at the precinct, Chief Reynolds watched the press conference on TV, his face unreadable. He knew that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The town was on edge, the officers were under fire, and the pressure was mounting. He had to make a decision, and soon. But no matter what he did, he knew there would be consequences. The only question was, how far would they reach? And as the sun set over Crestwood, casting long shadows over the quiet streets, one thing was clear. This was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The days following Evelyn's press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Crestwood, once a quiet town where nothing much happened, was now the epicenter of a national conversation about race, justice, and accountability. The protests outside the precinct grew larger, with people from neighboring towns joining in. The counter-protests grew louder too, with tensions simmering just below the surface. The mayor had called for a town hall meeting, hoping to bring everyone together to find a way forward. But as the day of the meeting approached, it was clear that no one was ready to back down. Evelyn spent those days working tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, activists, and even some of the officers from the precinct. She knew that if she wanted real change, she had to build bridges, not burn them. But it wasn't easy. Every conversation was fraught with tension, every handshake a calculated risk. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her, the eyes of the town and the world, watching her every move. But she also knew that this was her moment, her chance to make a difference, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Officer Daniels, meanwhile, was struggling to hold himself. Together, the suspension had left him with too much time to think, and his thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, anger, and fear. He had started avoiding the news, unable to bear the constant reminders of his mistake. But he couldn't avoid the whispers, the sideways glances from his neighbors, the way people seemed to cross the street when they saw him coming. He felt like a stranger in his own town, a pariah. And the worst part was, he knew he deserved it. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he was paying the price. Officer Harris, on the other hand, was trying to stay under the radar. He had stopped, going out altogether, spending his days holed up in his apartment trying to figure out what to do next. He had thought about reaching out to Evelyn, about apologizing, but he didn't know how. Every time he picked up the phone, he put it back, down, unsure of what to say. He felt trapped, caught between his guilt and his fear of what might happen if he spoke up. But he also knew that he couldn't stay silent forever. Sooner or later, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Chief Reynolds was feeling the pressure, too. The town hall meeting was just hours away, and he still didn't know what he was going to say. He had spent the last few days trying to balance the demands of the community with the needs of his officers, but it was an impossible task. No matter what he did, someone was going to be unhappy. And now, with the eyes of the nation on Crestwood, the stakes were higher than ever. He knew that this meeting could either be a turning point or a breaking point, and he wasn't sure which one it would be. As the sun set on the day of the town hall meeting, the tension in Crestwood was palpable. The streets were filled with people, some carrying signs, others just watching, waiting to see what would happen. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of electric energy that comes before a storm. Inside the town hall, the room was packed, every seat filled, every inch of standing room taken. The crowd was a mix of protesters, counter-protesters, curious onlookers, and reporters, all waiting to see how the night would unfold. Evelyn arrived just before the meeting was set to begin. Flanked by Marcus and a few members of her team, she could feel the weight of the room's attention as she made her way to the front, the murmurs of the crowd following her like a wave. She took her seat, her expression calm but determined. She knew that this was her moment, her chance to make a difference. But she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The room was a powder keg, and one wrong move could set it off. Chief Reynolds took the podium first, his face grim but resolute. He began by acknowledging the events of the past. Few days, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "We made a mistake," he said, his words echoing through the silent room. "And for that, I am deeply sorry. But this is not just about one incident. It's about a system that has failed too many people for too long. And it's up to us to fix it." The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and boos, the tension in the room reaching a boiling point. Evelyn stood up, her presence commanding attention. She walked to the podium, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could see the anger, the fear, the hope in their faces, and she knew that what she said next would shape the future of Crestwood. "This is not about blame," she began, her voice strong and clear. "This is about accountability. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in making our community better. And it's about having the courage to have the hard conversations, to listen to each other, even when it's uncomfortable, because that's the only way we're going to move forward." As she spoke, the room grew quieter, the tension easing just a little, but it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. And as the meeting continued, with people from all sides standing up to share their thoughts, it was clear that this was far from over. The real work was just beginning. Outside, the streets were still filled with people, the energy of the crowd spilling out into the night. The town hall meeting had been a start, but it was just that, a start. The real test would be what happened next, and as the people of Crestwood began to disperse, heading home or to the local diner or the park to continue the conversation, one thing was clear. This was a moment that would define them. The question was, how would they rise to the challenge? As the town hall meeting wrapped up, the crowd began to disperse, but the energy in the air didn't fade. If anything, it felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. Evelyn stayed behind, talking quietly with a group of community leaders, her expression thoughtful but tense. She had hoped the meeting would be a step toward healing, but the deep divisions in the room had made it clear that this was only the beginning. Just as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Marcus. His voice was urgent, almost breathless. "Evelyn, you need to see this now." Moments later, she was back in her office, staring at her laptop screen. Marcus had sent her a link to a video that had just been posted online. It was security footage from the day of her arrest, but it wasn't from the street where the incident had taken place. It was from inside the precinct. The video showed Officers Daniels and Harris in the break room, talking in hushed tones. At first, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary, just two cops venting after a long day. But then, Daniel said something that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "We need to get ahead of this," he muttered, his voice low but clear. "If she pushes for an investigation, it's not just us who'll go down. The whole department could be exposed." Evelyn replayed the clip, her mind racing. What were they talking about? What was there to expose? She had always suspected that there were deeper issues within the Crestwood Police Department, but this was the first real evidence she had seen. She turned to Marcus, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to find out what they're hiding, and we need to do it fast." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was sitting in his car outside the precinct, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had just seen the video too, and he knew what it meant. The walls were closing in, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep it together. He thought about calling Harris, but he wasn't sure he could trust him anymore. The truth was, he wasn't sure he could trust anyone. He had made a deal with the devil, and now it was coming back to haunt him. Harris, on the other hand, was trying to stay calm. He had seen the video, but he wasn't as worried as Daniels. He had always been better at keeping his cool, at thinking on his feet, but even he knew that this changed everything. If Evelyn got her hands on the rest of the footage, if she started digging deeper, it wouldn't just be their careers on the line. It could be their freedom. He thought about reaching out to Daniels, about coming up with a plan, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure if they were on the same side anymore. Back at the precinct, Chief Reynolds was dealing with his own crisis. The video had gone viral, and the phones were ringing off the hook. Reporters were camped outside, demanding answers. He had tried to keep a lid on things, but it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. He called a meeting with his top officers, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to get ahead of this," he said, echoing Daniels's words from the video. "If this gets out, it's not just a few bad apples. It's the whole damn tree." As the night wore on, the tension in Crestwood continued to build. The video had sparked a new wave of outrage, with people demanding a full investigation into the police department. Evelyn knew that this was her chance to push for real change, But she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The deeper she dug, the more resistance she would face. And the more resistance she faced, the more dangerous it would become. She spent the next few hours poring over files, looking for anything that might connect the dots. Marcus was by her side, his sharp legal mind helping her navigate the maze of information. They found a few leads, suspicious arrests, missing evidence, a pattern of complaints that had been swept under the rug. But it wasn't enough. They needed something concrete, something that would force the department to take action. Just as they were about to call it a night, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was an anonymous tip sent through an encrypted messaging app. The message was short but chilling. Check the evidence locker. Box 47. You'll find what you're looking for. Evelyn and Marcus exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding. This could be the break they needed, or it could be a trap. Either way, they had to check it out. The precinct was quiet when they arrived, the halls empty except for the occasional officer on night duty. Evelyn and Marcus moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They found the evidence locker without any trouble, but getting inside was another matter. The door was locked, and the keypad required a code. Evelyn was about to suggest finding another way in when Marcus held up a hand. "Wait," he whispered. He pulled out his phone and typed something into a search engine. A few seconds later, he had the code. "Sometimes," he said with a small smile, "it pays to know people." Inside the locker, they found Box 47 tucked away in a corner. It was unmarked, just like the tip had said. Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a stack of files, each one more damning than the last. There were reports of misconduct, evidence tampering, even a few cases of outright corruption. But the most shocking thing was the names. Some of the highest-ranking officers in the department were implicated, including Chief Reynolds. Evelyn felt a surge of anger, but also a flicker of hope. This was it. This was the evidence they needed to bring the whole system crashing down. But as she closed the box and turned to leave, she heard a noise behind her. She froze, her heart pounding. Someone was in the locker with them. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows. And then she saw him, Officer Daniels, standing in the doorway, his face pale but determined. In his hand was a gun. "I can't let you take that," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I'm sorry, Evelyn. I really am. But you don't understand what's at stake." Evelyn stared at him, her mind racing. She had always known this would be dangerous, but she hadn't expected it to come to this. She took a step forward, her voice calm but steady. "It's over, Daniels. You can't keep hiding the truth. It's time to do the right thing." Daniels hesitated, his hand trembling as he gripped the gun. For a moment, it looked like he might lower it. But then, from somewhere in the shadows, another voice spoke. "She's right, you know. It's over." Evelyn turned, her eyes widening in shock. Standing there, his face grim but resolute, was Chief Reynolds, and behind him, a dozen officers, their expressions unreadable. The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like it could crack. Evelyn knew that this was the moment everything would change, but she also knew that it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The evidence locker was dead silent, the air thick with tension. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes darting between Daniels, who still held the gun, and Chief Reynolds, who had just stepped into the room with a group of officers. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the entire world had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. Then slowly, Chief Reynolds raised his hands, his expression calm but serious. "Put the gun down, Daniels," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't the way." Daniels hesitated, his grip on the weapon tightening for a moment before his shoulders slumped. He lowered the gun, his face a mask of defeat. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know what else to do." Evelyn stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice firm. "It's over, Daniels. You can't keep hiding the truth. None of you can." She held up the files from Box 47, her eyes locking onto Reynolds. "This ends now." Reynolds sighed, running a hand over his face, He looked older suddenly, weighed down by the weight of what was about to happen. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's over, but it's not just about us, it's about the whole system. And if we're going to fix it, we need to do it the right way." Evelyn frowned, unsure of what he meant. But before she could ask, Reynolds turned to the officers behind him. "Stand down," he ordered. "This isn't a fight we can win, not like this." The officers exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed, stepping back and lowering their weapons. Evelyn felt a flicker of relief, but she knew this wasn't over yet. She turned to Daniels, who was still standing there, looking lost. "You have a choice," she said. "You can keep running or you can help me make this right, but either way, the truth is coming out." Daniels nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I'll help," he said. "I don't know if it'll make a difference, but I'll help." With that, the tension in the room began to ease, but Evelyn knew there was still a long road ahead. She, Marcus, and Daniels spent the next few hours going through the files, piecing together the full extent of the corruption within the department. It was worse than they had imagined. Bribes, evidence tampering, even cover-ups of violent crimes. The names of high-ranking officials were everywhere, and it was clear that this went far beyond Crestwood. As the sun rose over the town, Evelyn called a press conference. The crowd was larger than ever, the air buzzing with anticipation. She stepped up to the podium, the files in her hands, and took a deep breath. "What you're about to hear will shock you," she began, her voice strong and clear. "But it's a story that needs to be told, because the only way we can move forward is by confronting the truth, no matter how painful it may be." She laid out everything, the corruption, the cover-ups, the systemic failures that had allowed it all to happen. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the questions began to fly. What happens now? Will there be arrests? How can we trust the police again? Evelyn held up a hand, quieting the crowd. "This is just the beginning," she said. "But it's a start. We're going to hold everyone accountable, no matter how powerful they are. And we're going to rebuild this system from the ground up, so that something like this can never happen again." The crowd erupted into applause, but Evelyn didn't feel like celebrating. She knew this was just the first step in a long, difficult journey, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. As the press conference wrapped up, Marcus pulled her aside. "You did it," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "You actually did it." Evelyn shook her head. "We did it," she corrected. "But it's not over yet. Not by a long shot." Just then her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. She opened it, her heart skipping a beat as she read the words on the screen. "You think you've won, but the game's not over. Watch your back." Evelyn stared at the message, a chill running down her spine. She showed it to Marcus, who frowned. "Who could that be?" he asked. "I don't know," Evelyn said quietly. "But whoever it is, they're not done yet." As she looked out over the crowd, the weight of what she had started settled over her. She had exposed the truth, but she had also made enemies, powerful ones. And they weren't going to let her walk away without a fight. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. She had come too far to back down now. Whatever came next, she was ready. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice. It was about change. And she wasn't going to stop until she got it. The story of Crestwood was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was heading in the right direction. And as Evelyn walked away from the podium, her head held high, she knew that no matter what happened next, she had made a difference. And that was enough. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Crestwood, once a quiet town, was now at the center of a national reckoning. Evelyn's revelations had sparked a wave of investigations, not just in Crestwood, but across the state. The files from Box 47 had opened a Pandora's box of corruption, and there was no closing it now. Reporters flooded the town, digging into every corner of the police department, while activists and community leaders worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. Evelyn found herself at the heart of it all, her days filled with meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions. But despite the chaos, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This was what she had been fighting for. Real, tangible change. Officer Daniels, true to his word, had agreed to cooperate with the investigation. He sat down with Evelyn and Marcus, providing them with everything he knew about the department's inner workings. It wasn't easy for him. Every word felt like a betrayal, but he knew it was the only way to make things right. "I joined the force to protect people," he told Evelyn one evening, his voice heavy with regret. "Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I don't want to be that person anymore." Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said. "You're helping us fix this. That counts for something." Daniel's cooperation was a turning point. His testimony, combined with the evidence from Box 47, led to the arrests of several high-ranking officers, including Chief Reynolds. The town watched in stunned silence as the men they had once trusted were led away in handcuffs. It was a sobering moment, a reminder that no one was above the law. But it was also a moment of hope. For the first time in years, the people of Crestwood felt like they were being heard. Officer Harris, however, was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared the night of the town hall meeting, leaving behind only a note that read, "I'm sorry." Evelyn couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to run. Was it guilt, fear, or something else entirely? She knew they would eventually find him, but for now his absence was a lingering question mark in an otherwise clear picture. As the investigations continued, Evelyn turned her attention to the future. She worked with community leaders to draft a series of reforms aimed at rebuilding trust between the police and the people they served. Body cameras, mandatory bias training, and community oversight boards were just the beginning. It was a daunting task, but Evelyn was determined to see it through. She knew it wouldn't be easy, change never was, but she also knew it was necessary. One evening, as she was leaving her office, Evelyn found a small crowd gathered outside. They were holding signs that read, "Thank you, Evelyn, and Justice for Crestwood." She stopped, surprised by the show of support. A young girl stepped forward holding a bouquet of flowers. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, but sincere. "You're my hero." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat as she took the flowers. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't just about me, it's about all of us. We're in this together." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn allowed herself to smile. This was why she had fought so hard. Not for the headlines or the accolades, but for the people. For the little girl who saw her as a hero, for the families who had been failed by the system, for the community that was finally starting to heal. But even as she celebrated the progress, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The anonymous message she had received after the press conference lingered in the back of her mind, a constant reminder that the fight wasn't over. She had tried to trace the number, but it had led to a dead end. Whoever had sent it was still out there watching, waiting. Evelyn knew she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. A few days later, as she was preparing for another round of meetings, Marcus burst into her office, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. On the screen was a news article with a headline that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "Whistleblower found dead in apparent suicide." Evelyn's heart sank as she read the article. The whistleblower was a former officer who had been helping with the investigation. He had been found in his home, a single gunshot wound to the head. The police were calling it a suicide, but Evelyn knew better. This was a message, a warning to anyone who dared to speak out. She looked up at Marcus, her expression grim. "This isn't over," she said. "Not by a long shot." Marcus nodded, his face mirroring her determination. "We'll keep fighting," he said, "no matter what." And they did. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn and Marcus worked tirelessly to push the reforms through. Despite the growing resistance from those who wanted to maintain the status quo, they faced threats, setbacks, and even attempts to discredit them. But they refused to back down. Slowly but surely, they began to see results. The new policies were implemented, and the community started to see a difference. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was, but it was a start. As the months passed, Crestwood began to heal. The protests died down, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. The town hall meetings became less about anger and more about collaboration, as people from all walks of life came together to build a better future. Evelyn watched it all with a sense of pride, knowing that she had played a part in making it happen. But she never forgot the anonymous message, or the whistleblower who had paid the ultimate price for speaking out. She knew that the fight for justice was never truly over, that there would always be those who sought to undermine it. But she also knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight, there was hope. One evening, as she was walking home from the office, Evelyn found herself standing in front of the precinct. It looked different now, with its new signage and the community outreach center that had been built next door. She thought about everything that had happened: the arrest, the protests, the investigations, the reforms. It had been a long, difficult journey, but it had been worth. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. It was another message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, bracing herself for the worst. But this time the message was different. "Thank you for not giving up. You've inspired more people than you know." Evelyn smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. She didn't know who had sent the message, and she didn't need to. What mattered was that they were out there, watching, learning, and maybe even finding the courage to fight their own battles. As she walked away, the sun setting behind her, Evelyn knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who believed in justice, in fairness, in the idea that no one should be above the law. And as long as there were people like that in the world, there was always hope. The story of Crestwood was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was heading in the right direction. And that was enough.